These are the 17 real victims who tragically fell prey to serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Their stories are now dramatised in the hit Netflix series Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. It recounts in gruesome detail how the Milwaukee murderer subjected his victims to horrific torture and cannibalism. Some of their relatives have hit out at the show for distorting their loved ones' stories and glamorizing his crimes. Here, we remember the 17 beloved husbands, sons and fathers who had their lives cut short. Dahmer killed his first victim, Stephen Hicks, by beating him to death with a barbell on June 18, 1978, soon after his high school graduation. Hicks was an 18-year-old hitchhiker who Dahmer found sexually attractive. The killer picked him up and enticed him to his family home with the promise of a few beers before killing him when he tried to leave. After the murder, he masturbated over his victim's body before dismembering him and partially dissolving him in acid. Then he destroyed the rest of the remains with a sledgehammer. Dahmer waited nearly 10 years to kill his next victim after coming close to being caught while disposing of Hicks's remains. On November 20th, 1987, he picked up cook Stephen Tuomi at a gay bar in Milwaukee and took him back to a room at the Ambassador Hotel. He claims not to remember murdering Tuomi, but says he woke to find his victim's chest caved in and his hands bruised and bloody. Dahmer took the body back to his grandmother's house, decapitated his head and used it for sexual gratification. He kept Tuomi's skull as a trophy and disposed of the rest in the garbage. He met his next victim, 14-year-old runaway James Doxtator, at a bus stop outside a gay bar in Milwaukee. Dahmer offered him $50 to pose for a nude photo shoot before strangling him. He left the body in his grandmother's basement for 2 weeks before dismembering him. Dahmer also lured Richard Guerrero back to his grandmother's home in Milwaukee by using the same technique, offering money for nude photos. He drugged him and strangled him to death with a leather belt before having sex with his body and dismembering it. At his trial, Richard's sister told Dahmer, "You destroyed our lives."
You are el diablo, el puro diablo que estaba suelto en las calles de nosotros.
The next day, Dahmer murdered 24-year-old restaurant manager Anthony Sears after again picking him up in a bar. The killer found aspiring model Sears exceptionally attractive and preserved his head in acetone to keep as his first permanent trophy. Almost a year would pass before he murdered 32-year-old sex worker Ricky Beeks in his apartment in Milwaukee. He kept the father of one's skull in his fridge and used other body parts to decorate his home. Just 2 weeks passed before Dahmer murdered 28-year-old aspiring model Eddie Smith in the same apartment after also picking him up at a gay bar. Dahmer called Smith's sister in April 1991 and told her, "Don't bother looking for your brother, he's dead." Aspiring dancer Ernest Miller came across Dahmer outside a bookshop on Labor Day weekend. The 22-year-old met the same fate as the killer's other victims at his flat in Milwaukee.
"I'm not for the death penalty, but you are a perfect candidate."
The remains of ninth victim, 23-year-old David Thomas, were never found, although police discovered Polaroids of his body among Dahmer's possessions.
This man should never be able to walk the face of earth or to be able to harm anyone else again.
Aspiring model Curtis Strouter met Dahmer at a bus stop outside Marquette University in Milwaukee. This time, Dahmer filmed his victim, a 17-year-old nursing assistant, as he drugged, strangled and dismembered him.
I can never forgive you. I hope you can deal with what you've done.
Errol Lindsay had been sent out on an errand to get a key cut on the day he was murdered in a most horrific fashion. Dahmer drugged 19-year-old Lindsay, drilled a hole in his head and poured hydrochloric acid into it in a twisted experiment. It would be the first of the killer's many attempts to turn his victims into zombies before murdering them. Deaf and mute Tony Hughes lost his hearing when he was a child and learned to communicate through written notes and sign language. The 6th episode of the Netflix series shows Dahmer meeting aspiring model Hughes at a gay bar in Milwaukee and becoming friends. But his mother has criticised the show for an inaccurate portrayal of her son's death, adding, "It didn't happen like that. I don't see how they can use our names and put stuff out like that." Dahmer and Hughes had met before, but the exact nature of their friendship is unknown. He also drugged him and drilled a hole in his skull before pouring in hydrochloric acid. Dahmer claims Hughes awoke after his experiment and said, "I have a headache," before Dahmer strangled him to death. 14-year-old Conrad Synthesom has perhaps the most tragic story of any of Dahmer's victims. The 14-year-old, whose brother was also a victim of Dahmer's molestation, came unbelievably close to escaping before two police officers let him down. He was lured to Dahmer's apartment with the same offer of cash for nude photos. But as Dahmer assaulted him, he managed to escape into the streets of Milwaukee while bruised, bleeding, and heavily drugged. Neighbours called the police, but in a tragic twist, police actually ended up returning Conrad to Dahmer. The killer managed to convince two police officers, John Balsarac and Joseph Cabrisho, that Conrad was in fact his 19-year-old lover who was simply drunk. The two officers told neighbours who still had concerns to shut up. They left the boy with Dahmer and listed the call as a dispute between homosexuals. Dahmer killed Conrad by injecting hydrochloric acid into his brain 10 minutes after the officers left the apartment. Officers Balsarac and Cabrisho were later fired. Matthew Turner had run away from home as a child and was 19 years old when he met Dahmer at Chicago's Gay Pride Parade. Dahmer lured him back to his apartment in Milwaukee, where he again drugged and killed him before dismembering the body. Dahmer would select his next victim 5 days later at a Chicago bus stop. He lured 20-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger back to his home in Milwaukee and spent the night with him. This time, the killer injected boiling water into his victim's skull, putting him into a coma, from which he died 2 days later. The next person to fall victim to Dahmer was 24-year-old bodybuilder and father of one family man, Oliver Lacey. Once again, the killer used the lure of cash for photos to get the victim to his apartment, where he drugged and dismembered him. This is one of the only known times Dahmer indulged in cannibalism. He fried Lacey's right bicep and ate it, later telling police he wanted to try it because it was so big, adding, "It tasted like beef." Dahmer's last victim was 25-year-old Joseph Braidhoft, a husband and father of 3 children who had moved to Milwaukee from Minnesota to find work. He was once again lured to Dahmer's apartment with the offer of cash to pose nude for photos. The killer strangled Braidhoft and left his corpse on his bed for 2 days.
And I hope you go to hell.
Just 7 days later, Dahmer would dramatically be caught after intended victim Tracy Edwards managed to escape from his clutches.